This detailed record chronicles a particularly high-stakes and palpable confrontation between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during a significant Senate committee hearing. The interaction serves as a fascinating microcosm of the broader ideological and generational divide currently fracturing the landscape of American political discourse. It was not merely a debate over policy, but a fundamental collision of two diametrically opposed styles of communication and governance that rarely intersect with such volatility. The atmosphere in the hearing room was charged with an anticipation that suggested this was more than a routine inquiry, but rather a calculated strategic encounter designed to highlight inconsistencies in public messaging. Observers noted that the tension was immediate and visible, setting the stage for a dramatic exchange that would be dissected by political analysts long after the gavel fell. The text vividly portrays a conflict of styles that goes beyond simple partisan disagreement and touches on the very nature of political persuasion in the modern digital age. Representative Ocasio-Cortez is described as utilizing a method rooted deeply in emotive storytelling, a technique that has proven incredibly effective in mobilizing younger demographics and dominating social media platforms. Her approach often relies on utilizing language that is designed to garner headlines and provoke a visceral reaction from her base, focusing on the moral weight of her arguments rather than the granular details of implementation. This narrative-driven style allows for a powerful connection with viewers who prioritize empathy and social justice, positioning her as a champion of the underrepresented against established power structures. However, the document suggests that this heavy reliance on emotional resonance can sometimes leave openings for opponents who prioritize forensic scrutiny over rhetorical flourish. In stark contrast to the representative's impassioned delivery, Senator Kennedy is depicted as countering with a methodical and almost clinical presentation of specific evidence. His strategy appeared to be purposefully designed to strip away the emotional veneer of the representative's arguments and force the conversation into the rigid territory of hard data and documented facts. Rather than engaging in a shouting match or attempting to match her emotional intensity, Kennedy adopted the persona of a rigorous prosecutor dissecting a witness's inconsistent testimony. This juxtaposition created a compelling dynamic where the ethereal nature of political narrative was abruptly grounded by the physical weight of printed receipts and timelines. The friction between these two approaches highlights the ongoing struggle between performing for a camera and enduring the tedious rigor of legislative accountability. A central element of this confrontation, as described in the source material, was Senator Kennedy's theatrical yet substantive use of visual aids to anchor his interrogation. He did not arrive empty-handed, but instead brought a series of color-coded binders that served as a visual representation of the meticulous research his team had conducted prior to the hearing. These binders were not mere props but were referenced frequently to challenge the credibility of his opponent on several specific fronts, turning abstract accusations into tangible paperwork. The act of physically opening a binder and citing a specific page number creates an air of authority that is difficult to counter with generalizations or broad ideological statements. This tactic effectively slowed down the tempo of the exchange, forcing the representative to respond to line-item queries rather than allowing her to pivot back to her preferred talking points. The first major pillar of Kennedy's challenge focused on the murky and often complex world of campaign finance, a topic that demands precision and transparency. By leveraging the contents of his dossiers, the senator methodically questioned the integrity of the representative's financial operations, contrasting her public stance on money and politics with the reality of her own filings. This line of questioning was designed to chip away at the moral high ground often claimed by progressive figures regarding corporate influence and dark money. The text implies that Kennedy did not just make vague assertions but pointed to specific discrepancies that required immediate and specific explanations, which were reportedly not forthcoming. The use of financial documents as a weapon in a Senate hearing transforms a philosophical debate into a forensic audit, a shift that played entirely to Kennedy's strengths. Moving beyond finances, the confrontation escalated as the senator pivoted to allegations of environmental hypocrisy, a charge that strikes at the core of the representative's political identity. The narrative describes how Kennedy utilized the evidence at hand to highlight a divergence between the representative's aggressive advocacy for the Green New Deal and her personal or political carbon footprint. This segment of the hearing was particularly damaging because it sought to expose a do as I say, not as I do mentality that resonates negatively with independent voters. By presenting concrete examples of travel habits or resource usage that contradicted her legislative proposals, Kennedy aimed to paint a picture of performative activism. The friction here underscores the difficulty of maintaining ideological purity while operating within a system that necessitates compromise and consumption. The interrogation took an even more personal turn when the subject shifted to the representative's handling of family matters in Puerto Rico, specifically regarding her grandmother. This portion of the exchange was fraught with tension, as it bridged the gap between public policy failures and personal responsibility. Kennedy's use of the color-coded binders in this context suggests he had prepared a timeline or financial records that contradicted the representative's public blaming of government negligence for her family's plight. The implication was that while the representative was using her family's struggle as a political bludgeon against her opponents, she may have neglected personal avenues of assistance that were available to her. This accusation was calculated to pierce the narrative of the caring advocate by introducing a counter-narrative of personal neglect masked by political outrage. Throughout this multifaceted interrogation, the source material characterizes the dialogue as a strategic victory for the senator, largely due to his reliance on documented verification. The phrase documented receipts becomes a recurring theme, symbolizing the triumph of objective reality over curated public image. Kennedy's ability to produce a physical record for every claim made it nearly impossible for the representative to dismiss his questions as mere partisan attacks. This dynamic shifted the power balance in the room, placing the representative on the defensive and forcing her to answer for the gaps between her rhetoric and the documented reality. It serves as a case study in how preparation and specific evidence can neutralize even the most charismatic of political communicators. The overarching theme of the text is the fundamental tension between performative politics, which thrives on likes and shares, and the intense scrutiny of a legislative body. It suggests that while emotional storytelling is a powerful tool for campaigning and fundraising, it often withers under the harsh light of a committee hearing where facts are paramount. The victory described is not necessarily one of policy implementation, but of exposing the superficiality that can sometimes plague modern political movements. Kennedy's performance is framed as a reminder that eventually, every political narrative must be reconciled with the ledger of truth. Ultimately, the encounter stands as a stark warning that in the halls of the Senate, a well-organized binder can be more devastating than a viral tweet. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted perceptibly as Senator Kennedy reached for the first of the heavy, color-coded binders resting on the mahogany table before him. This was no longer a discussion about abstract political philosophies or the broad strokes of legislative intent, but a sudden pivot toward the rigid and unforgiving world of forensic accounting. Kennedy opened the binder with a deliberate slowness that seemed calculated to heighten the tension, allowing the rustle of pages to echo through the silence of the chamber like a warning shot. He smoothed the paper in front of him, his eyes scanning the highlighted rows of data before locking onto the representative with a gaze that was both inquisitive and piercing. It became immediately clear to every observer in the room that the senator was not interested in a battle of wits, but rather an execution of facts that had been meticulously gathered over months of investigation. The subject matter turned to the labyrinthine and often opaque network of campaign finance, a topic that stands in stark contrast to the representative's curated brand of transparency and anti-corporate purity. Kennedy began by reciting specific dates and dollar amounts, his voice maintaining a calm and rhythmic cadence that stripped the accusations of any immediate emotional heat. He presented a series of transaction records that allegedly detailed the movement of funds between various political action committees and private consulting firms linked to the representative's inner circle. These were not vague allegations of impropriety but were presented as hard data points, challenging the narrative that her operation was solely fueled by small-dollar donations from working-class supporters. The juxtaposition of her populist rhetoric with the complex financial structures being read into the record created a dissonance that rippled through the audience. As the senator continued to read from the dossier, he focused on the specific mechanics of how money was being funneled through limited liability companies to obscure the ultimate destination of the capital. He questioned the representative on the rationale behind these transfers, asking why a campaign built on the promise of sunlight and clarity would require such convoluted accounting architecture usually reserved for corporate behemoths. The questions were framed simply, yet they were designed to be impossible to answer without conceding a degree of hypocrisy or claiming ignorance of her own campaign's operations. Kennedy's strategy was to trap her between the rock of admitting to standard political maneuvering and the hard place of her own moralizing platform. The air in the room grew heavy as the representative shifted in her seat, realizing that the conversation had moved far beyond the safe harbor of talking points and into the dangerous waters of legal liability. The representative attempted to parry these thrusts by characterizing the line of questioning as a bad faith attack on a young, progressive woman of color attempting to navigate a broken system. She spoke with passion about the necessity of utilizing available tools to fight against well-funded incumbents, trying to reframe the complex accounting as a survival mechanism rather than a deception. However, Kennedy refused to let the emotional appeal derail the trajectory of his examination, ignoring her narrative reframing to point back to the ledger on the table. He simply tapped the open page with his index finger, a gesture that served as a visual anchor, reminding the committee that the numbers printed there did not have feelings or political affiliations. This persistence forced the dialogue back to the uncomfortable specifics of vendor payments and overhead costs, areas where rhetorical flair offers very little protection against the cold reality of math. Kennedy then introduced a specific timeline that overlaid her public condemnations of dark money with the dates of significant transfers into her own aligned entities. This visual aid was particularly damaging, as it created a direct correlation between her most vocal periods of virtue signaling and the moments of her most aggressive financial obfuscation. He asked her to reconcile the two realities, inquiring how one could stand on a podium and decry the influence of hidden capital while simultaneously benefiting from a system that masked the flow of millions. The question hung in the air, rhetorical in its delivery but substantive in its impact, effectively stripping away the veneer of the underdog fighting the machine. It suggested that the representative was not merely a participant in the system she claimed to despise, but an adept operator who had mastered its darker arts while condemning them. The interrogation deepened as Kennedy turned to a specific section of the binder marked with red tabs, indicating high-priority contradictions regarding the payment of campaign staff and family members. He read aloud a series of receipts that appeared to show payments made to romantic partners and close relatives for services that were vaguely defined in the official filings. The senator questioned the meritocratic nature of these hires, asking whether the funds donated by struggling Americans were intended to subsidize the lifestyles of her immediate social circle. This line of questioning struck a personal nerve, moving the critique from professional conduct to personal ethics and the stewardship of other people's money. The implication was clear, that the movement she led was perhaps less of a revolution and more of a family business operating under the guise of public service. In response, the representative's demeanor shifted from confident defiance to a more guarded and defensive posture, her responses becoming shorter and more legalistic in nature. She consulted briefly with the aide seated behind her, a visual cue that signaled a retreat from the offensive storytelling mode she typically favored. Kennedy pounced on this moment of hesitation, noting for the record that the simple questions regarding payroll seemed to require a team of lawyers to answer. He leveraged the silence to drive home the point that transparency should be effortless if there is nothing to hide, whereas complexity is often the hallmark of deceit. The dynamic in the room had fundamentally altered, with the senator now dictating the tempo and the representative forced to react to the steady drumbeat of evidence. The discussion then pivoted to the vendors used by her campaign, with Kennedy highlighting that many of the consultants paid strictly for strategy were unlisted entities with no digital footprint. He presented research showing that several of these companies shared addresses with the representative's campaign headquarters or personal residences, raising the specter of self-dealing. He asked the representative to explain the services rendered by these ghost firms and why they commanded such premium fees compared to industry standards. The detailed nature of this inquiry showcased the depth of the opposition research, revealing that Kennedy's team had not just read the headlines but had audited the footnotes of her entire career. It was a methodical dismantling of the idea that her campaign was a chaotic but well-meaning grassroots effort, painting it instead as a calculated machine. Kennedy's tone throughout this financial dissection remained maddeningly polite, his southern drawl softening the edges of accusations that would otherwise sound aggressive. He referred to the representative with deferential titles, using the decorum of the Senate to contrast with the sordid nature of the financial details he was exposing. This stylistic choice served to make the evidence appear even more damning, as it was presented not with anger, but with a tone of disappointed curiosity. He positioned himself as a diligent public servant simply trying to understand how the math worked, a posture that made the representative's evasions look increasingly suspicious. It was a masterclass in the theater of the Senate, where the calmest voice often wields the most destructive power. The focus shifted again, this time to the compliance issues that had been flagged by the Federal Election Commission, documents which Kennedy produced with a flourish. He cited specific letters of warning sent to the representative's treasurer, detailing repeated failures to properly itemize expenses and identify donors. He asked why a campaign that prided itself on accountability would repeatedly run afoul of the basic reporting requirements established to protect the integrity of elections. The representative tried to dismiss these as clerical errors common to first-time candidates, but Kennedy countered with the sheer volume of the infractions. He argued that a pattern of clerical errors eventually ceases to be a mistake and begins to look like a strategy of intentional noncompliance. As the financial segment of the hearing neared its conclusion, Kennedy closed the binder with a definitive thud, signaling that he had made his point regarding the money trail. He summarized his findings by stating that while the representative was a gifted storyteller, her financial narrative was a work of fiction that did not survive the scrutiny of a balance sheet. He noted that the disconnect between her words and her wallet was not just a political liability but a breach of trust with the very people she claimed to represent. The room remained quiet, the weight of the receipts and timelines pressing down on the proceedings, leaving a palpable sense that the moral high ground had been contested and potentially lost. The senator did not gloat, but simply adjusted his cuffs and prepared to move to the next binder, leaving the financial questions to linger in the official record like an unresolved chord. The psychological toll of this segment was evident on the representative's face, which displayed a mixture of frustration and exhaustion usually hidden behind a polished media smile. The relentless nature of the fact-based attack had denied her the oxygen she needed to launch the counterattacks that usually went viral on social media. She had been forced to play a game of defense on a field defined by her opponent, answering for line items rather than leading a movement. This was the strategic victory of the receipts approach. It neutralized charisma by drowning it in the mundane but essential details of governance. The hearing moved forward, but the shadow of the financial dossier remained, casting a long silhouette over the credibility of the arguments that were to follow. Kennedy then bridged the conversation toward the broader implications of these financial discrepancies, suggesting that how one manages a campaign is a microcosm of how one would manage the country. He posited that if a small organization could not be run with fiscal discipline and ethical clarity, then entrusting that same leadership with the federal budget was a dangerous proposition. This argument resonated with the more conservative members of the committee, who nodded in agreement as he drew the line between personal disorganization and public waste. The representative attempted to interrupt, to inject a defense of her policy goals, but the senator yielded no time, insisting that the foundation must be sound before the house can be built. It was a philosophical checkmate, using the specific evidence to undermine the general competence of his adversary. The use of the color-coded system became a recurring visual motif, with the red binder of finance now set aside to make room for the green binder of environmental policy. The transition was seamless, yet the audience understood that the groundwork laid in the financial segment was intended to weaken the representative's standing before the next topic began. By eroding her credibility on money, Kennedy had preemptively cast doubt on her integrity regarding the climate, setting the stage for the next phase of the confrontation. The strategic layering of these attacks showed a level of preparation that went beyond standard partisan bickering. It was a coordinated effort to dismantle a political brand, one binder at a time. As the proceedings paused briefly for a recess, the buzz in the room was not about the representative's soaring rhetoric, but about the specific numbers Kennedy had read into the record. Reporters could be seen typing furiously, likely fact-checking the LLC names and transfer dates that had just been exposed to the public eye. The narrative control had shifted from the podium to the press table, where the veracity of the claims would be litigated in the court of public opinion. Kennedy sat back, taking a sip of water, appearing entirely unruffled by the intensity of the exchange he had just orchestrated. Across the aisle, the representatives' team was huddled in an intense conference, likely damage control for a new cycle they had not anticipated. The lingering impact of the financial interrogation was that it transformed the representative from a crusader into a politician, a label she had fought hard to avoid. By forcing her to answer for the mundane corruptions of campaign finance, Kennedy dragged her down from the pedestal of activism and into the mud of the establishment. It was a deconstruction of the outsider myth, achieved not through insults, but through the relentless application of bureaucratic reality. The audience was left with the uncomfortable realization that in Washington, even the most revolutionary figures must eventually account for the ledger. The stage was now set for the next chapter, where the battle would move from the bank account to the atmosphere. With the financial dossier now closed and pushed to the side, Senator Kennedy reached for the second binder in his stack, this one a vibrant shade of green that signaled a shift to environmental policy. The color choice was widely interpreted as a deliberate piece of political theater, a visual nod to the Green New Deal that the representative championed with such ferocity in the media. Kennedy took a moment to adjust his spectacles, peering over the rim at the witness table with a look of grandfatherly concern that masked the forensic intent of his next line of questioning. The room seemed to brace itself, understanding that while the financial questions were damaging, the environmental debate struck at the very heart of the representative's ideological brand and public identity. He opened the green binder to a page marked with a series of sticky notes, his finger tracing a line of data that clearly contradicted the austere carbon lifestyle advocated by the witness. Kennedy began by acknowledging the ambitious scope of the representative's climate proposals, praising the passion with which she spoke about saving the planet for future generations. However, his tone quickly pivoted from complimentary to inquisitorial as he contrasted the drastic lifestyle changes she demanded of the American public with the records of her own travel habits. He read aloud a detailed log of domestic flights taken by her and her campaign staff over a period of 6 months, focusing specifically on short-hop trips that could have easily been accomplished via train or car. The senator noted the irony of utilizing high-carbon aviation for distances where Amtrak provides reliable service, especially for a politician who had frequently called for the abolition of air travel in favor of rail. The recitation of flight numbers and departure times created a rhythmic drumbeat of hypocrisy that echoed off the wood-paneled walls of the committee room. The tension escalated when Kennedy highlighted a specific instance where the representative had utilized a private vehicle for a journey of only a few blocks, a trip that occurred shortly after a speech condemning the reliance on fossil fuels. He held up a blown-up graphic of a map, tracing the short route with a laser pointer to emphasize the absurdity of the carbon expenditure for such a negligible distance. The visual aid was devastating in its simplicity, reducing complex policy debates down to a single, undeniable image of personal convenience overriding political principle. Kennedy asked whether the rules of the Green New Deal were intended to apply to the governing class, or if they were merely restrictions to be imposed upon the working class while the elite continued to travel in comfort. This framing tapped into a deep vein of populist resentment, positioning the representative not as a savior of the environment, but as a member of a privileged aristocracy immune to its own edicts. Representative Ocasio-Cortez attempted to regain her footing by arguing that systemic change requires operating within the current infrastructure, and that individual choices are negligible compared to industrial pollution. She spoke with urgency about the need to focus on corporate accountability, rather than nitpicking the travel logistics of a single congresswoman trying to do her job. However, Kennedy was prepared for this defense and immediately directed her attention to a spreadsheet detailing the usage of gas-guzzling SUVs by her campaign team. He pointed out that there were electric or hybrid options available in her district, yet her operation had consistently opted for large, combustion engine vehicles for their daily operations. He asked simply why a campaign built on the urgency of the climate crisis would not prioritize green transportation when it was readily available and cost-effective. The interrogation then turned to the representative's vocal criticism of the agricultural industry, specifically her comments regarding methane emissions and the consumption of beef. Kennedy turned the page to reveal a series of receipts from campaign events and staff dinners where the menu was decidedly non-vegetarian, featuring items that she had publicly claimed were destroying the planet. He read the orders into the record with a dry wit, contrasting the dire warnings about cow farts with the evident enjoyment of hamburgers by her inner circle. The senator's strategy was to paint a picture of limousine liberalism, where the aesthetic of environmentalism is embraced for votes, but the sacrifices are outsourced to others. The juxtaposition of her apocalyptic rhetoric with the mundane reality of her team's dietary choices made the grandstanding seem performative rather than principled. Kennedy paused to let the laughter from the gallery subside, his expression remaining stoic as he allowed the absurdity of the hamburger receipts to sink in. He then broadened the scope of his inquiry to the carbon footprint of her merchandise operation, producing a sample of the packaging used to ship her campaign t-shirts and posters. He noted that despite the availability of biodegradable materials, her store utilized standard plastics and non-recycled paper, contributing to the very waste stream she sought to eliminate. He asked how she reconciled the mass production of promotional materials with her stance on consumerism and waste, questioning whether the spread of her brand was more important than the health of the oceans. It was a granular attack that attacked the supply chain of her political celebrity, finding fault in the logistical details that most politicians overlook. The representative's frustration was becoming visible, her hands clasping and unclasping on the table as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't sound offensive or dismissive. She tried to pivot back to the scientific consensus on climate change, citing reports on rising sea levels and extreme weather events to recenter the conversation on the macro threat. Kennedy, however, refused to debate the science of the climate, choosing instead to remain steadfastly focused on the ethics of the messenger. He argued that if the crisis were truly as existential as she claimed, her behavior would reflect a wartime level of sacrifice rather than the standard conveniences of modern political life. This refusal to engage on her preferred ground left her flailing against the specific, documented contradictions of her own behavior. The Green Binder also contained a section dedicated to the energy efficiency of her district offices and personal residence, data which Kennedy presented with the meticulousness of a building inspector. He cited utility bills that suggested a lack of effort to conserve energy, comparing her usage rates unfavorably to the average household in her district. He asked if she had taken advantage of the government programs she touted for weatherization and retrofitting, or if those were merely talking points for brochures. The implication was that true leadership is demonstrated in the privacy of one's own home, not just under the bright lights of a television studio. By dragging the conversation into the domestic sphere, Kennedy blurred the line between public official and private citizen, arguing that for a moral crusader, there is no distinction. As the senator continued his relentless dissection, he brought up the issue of offsets, asking if her campaign had purchased carbon credits to neutralize the emissions from their extensive travel. When the answer appeared to be in the negative or unclear, Kennedy seized on this as evidence of a lack of seriousness, noting that even corporate polluters often take that basic step. He characterized her approach as all retweets, no receipts, a phrase that seemed destined to be clipped for the evening news. The green binder, which had initially seemed like a prop, had turned into an indictment of the gap between progressive ideology and the practical realities of living it. The room watched as the representative's narrative of moral superiority was systematically dismantled by the very data she often demanded of others. Kennedy's questioning style during this segment was particularly effective because it avoided the trap of denying climate change, which would have allowed the representative to cast him as a dinosaur. Instead, he accepted the premise of her argument, that the planet is in danger, and used it as a weapon to attack her lack of personal adherence to the solution. This tactical nuance confused her standard defense mechanisms, which were calibrated to fight denialism, not accusations of hypocrisy. By agreeing that the house was on fire but pointing out that she was holding a box of matches, Kennedy outflanked her rhetorically. It was a sophisticated maneuver that appealed to independent voters who dislike preachy politicians who do not practice what they preach. The climax of the environmental segment came when Kennedy presented a side-by-side comparison of her schedule with that of a moderate colleague who traveled by rail and drove a hybrid. He asked why this colleague, who did not co-sponsor the Green New Deal, had a significantly lower carbon footprint than the legislation's primary author. The visual contrast was stark, effectively stripping the representative of the title of climate champion and awarding it to the quiet competence of a less famous peer. The senator suggested that perhaps the true friends of the earth are those who act quietly, rather than those who shout loudly while flying in private jets. This comparison was the final nail in the argument, proving that a lower carbon lifestyle was possible for a member of Congress, just not one chosen by the witness. As Kennedy prepared to close the green binder, the air in the room felt different, as if the moral gravity had shifted from the witness table to the dais. He noted that it is easy to demand trillion-dollar overhauls of the global economy, but apparently much harder to simply recycle or take the bus. He left the binder open on the table, the green cover now looking less like a symbol of hope and more like a ledger of failures. The representative remained silent for a long moment, staring at the documents, her usual rapid-fire retorts failing her in the face of such granular personal scrutiny. The hearing moved on, but the image of the green binder and the flight logs remained seared into the minds of the observers. This segment of the hearing underscored the danger of building a political brand on absolute moral purity, as it creates a standard that is almost impossible to maintain under scrutiny. Kennedy's success lay in his ability to exploit this vulnerability, turning the representative's high ideals into a trap of her own making. The green binder demonstrated that in the age of information, every flight, every burger, and every Uber ride creates a data point that can be weaponized by a skilled opponent. It was a harsh lesson in the accountability of leadership, delivered with a southern drawl and a stack of paper. The narrative of the Green New Deal had been temporarily eclipsed by the narrative of the Green New Hypocrisy. The physiological reaction of the representative was telling. Her posture had stiffened, and she avoided making eye contact with the senator, focusing instead on her notes. The vibrancy and energy that typically defined her presence had been dampened by the relentless accumulation of inconvenient facts. Kennedy, conversely, seemed energized by the exchange, his movements fluid and confident as he organized his materials for the next phase. The psychological dominance he had established with the financial records was now cemented by the environmental contradictions. The audience sensed that the dismantling was not yet complete, and that the senator had more binders waiting in the wings. Ultimately, Part 3 serves as a study in the effectiveness of gotcha politics when backed by substantial research rather than empty insults. Kennedy proved that the most damaging attacks are not those that question a politician's intelligence, but those that question their sincerity. By exposing the disconnect between the representative's public demands and private indulgences, he eroded the trust that is essential for any populist movement. The green binder became a symbol of the complexity of modern governance, where symbols often crash against the rocks of reality. The hearing proceeded, but the echo of the flight logs lingered, a ghostly reminder of the carbon cost of political ambition. Senator Kennedy cleared the table of the previous documents, placing the green binder atop the growing stack of evidence before reaching for the final dossier, which was bound in a stark, slate blue cover. The color was fitting, as the mood in the committee room dropped to a freezing temperature, the air thick with an uncomfortable anticipation that signaled a crossing of the Rubicon. While the previous exchanges regarding finance and the environment were professional disputes over policy and conduct, this new line of inquiry threatened to pierce the veil of personal privacy and family dynamics. Kennedy opened the blue binder with a solemnity that bordered on mourning, his eyes lingering on the first page, which contained a series of printed social media posts and news clippings. He looked up at the representative, his expression stripped of the earlier bemusement, replaced now by a stern, judgmental gravity that suggested moral disappointment rather than political disagreement. The subject of this interrogation was the highly publicized plight of the representative's grandmother in Puerto Rico, a story that had been utilized extensively in the media to highlight the failures of federal aid. Kennedy began by recounting the timeline of the representative's public statements, wherein she had shared heart-wrenching images of her grandmother's dilapidated home to criticize the previous administration's disaster response. He acknowledged the tragedy of the situation and expressed his sympathy for the elderly woman's living conditions, establishing a baseline of human decency before launching his critique. However, the tone shifted sharply as he began to cross-reference the dates of the hurricane damage with the dates of the representative's ascension to national prominence and financial stability. He posed a question that was as simple as it was devastating. Why did a member of Congress, earning a significant salary, allow her own grandmother to live in squalor for months while waiting for the government to act? The blue binder contained a detailed breakdown of the estimated costs to repair the roof and living quarters of the home in question, figures that were relatively modest compared to the representative's personal income and campaign resources. Kennedy pointed out that while the representative was busy filming videos blaming the federal bureaucracy for the delay in aid, she possessed the immediate financial means to solve the problem herself. He argued that this inaction suggested a disturbing priority system, where the suffering of a family member was more valuable as a political prop than as a problem to be solved. The senator suggested that a dutiful granddaughter would have written a check immediately, rather than waiting for a photo opportunity to bemoan the slowness of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This accusation struck at the core of the cultural value of filial piety, painting the representative as someone who had sacrificed family obligation at the altar of political theater. As the representative attempted to interject, citing the systemic issues that prevent millions of Puerto Ricans from accessing aid, Kennedy refused to let the conversation drift into the abstract. He hammered on the specific agency of the individual, noting that while not everyone has the means to bypass the bureaucracy, she specifically did. He produced records of her travel expenses and wardrobe costs from the same period, contrasting the luxury of her life in Washington with the destitution she allowed to persist in Puerto Rico. The visual juxtaposition of red carpet galas and a leaking roof created a narrative of abandonment that was difficult to counter with sociological jargon. Kennedy's argument was grounded in the conservative principle of personal responsibility, positing that charity must begin at home before one can credibly demand it from the state. The interrogation took an even stranger and more contentious turn when Kennedy brought up the external fundraising efforts that had emerged in response to her viral posts. He referenced a conservative commentator who had raised over $100,000 in a matter of hours to assist the grandmother, an act of charity that the representative had publicly rejected. Kennedy asked her to explain the logic behind refusing private aid for a suffering relative simply because it came from an ideological opponent. He suggested that her rejection of the money was an act of supreme selfishness, effectively holding her grandmother hostage to her own political pride. The silence in the room was deafening as he asked whether her grandmother's comfort was less important than maintaining a partisan narrative of victimhood. The senator then dissected the Ab Whaler narrative as a case study in performative altruism, where the appearance of caring is prioritized over the act of helping. He read aloud tweets where the representative had attacked the fundraising effort, characterizing it as disingenuous or manipulative, while her grandmother's roof remained unrepaired. Kennedy leveraged this to argue that for the modern progressive, the existence of a problem is often more useful than its solution, as the problem fuels the grievance machine. He accused her of preferring a suffering grandmother she could tweet about over a housed grandmother who offered no political utility. It was a brutal character assessment that stripped away the veneer of the caring advocate to reveal a cold and calculating operator. The blue binder also contained witness statements and local reports from the area in Puerto Rico, which Kennedy used to challenge the representative's description of the local government's role. He highlighted that while she was blaming Washington, local mismanagement was rampant, yet she had remained silent on that front to protect her political allies on the island. He asked why her scrutiny was so selectively applied, targeting federal opponents while ignoring the corruption in her own backyard that contributed to the crisis. This line of questioning suggested that her concern for Puerto Rico was conditional, activated only when it could be weaponized against her perceived enemies in the Senate. The dossier painted a picture of a politician who used her heritage as a shield and a sword, but rarely as a genuine area of service. The representative's reaction to this onslaught was visibly visceral. Her composure cracked, and she accused the senator of weaponizing her family trauma for a political hit job. She spoke with a trembling voice about the dignity of the Puerto Rican people and the colonial history that necessitated federal reparations, trying to elevate the debate back to history and justice. Kennedy, however, remained unmoved by the emotional display, viewing it as yet another performance designed to deflect from the hard facts of the timeline. He simply tapped the blue binder and reiterated that history does not excuse the neglect of one's own blood when one has the checkbook to fix it. He framed her response not as righteous indignation, but as the defensive lashing out of someone caught in a moral contradiction. The senator then broadened the scope to discuss the concept of savior complexes in politics, arguing that the representative viewed herself as the savior of the masses while failing the specific individuals in her life. He drew a parallel between her legislative philosophy, which relies on massive, slow-moving government systems, and her personal conduct, which ignored immediate, private solutions. He posited that this mindset creates a culture of dependency, where citizens are taught to wait for a government savior that may never come, rather than taking agency. Kennedy used the grandmother incident as the ultimate metaphor for the failure of socialism, waiting for the state to fix a roof while the money sits in your own pocket. It was a philosophical indictment delivered through the lens of a singular, painful family drama. Kennedy's use of the timeline in the blue binder was particularly effective in neutralizing the victim narrative, as it showed a gap of several months between the storm and the public outcry. He asked what was happening during those intervening months, implying that the crisis was discovered only when it became politically convenient to discover it. He questioned the authenticity of the sudden urgency, suggesting that the tweets were drafted by a consultant rather than written by a distraught granddaughter. The implication was that the suffering was curated, timed to coincide with legislative battles in Washington rather than the needs of the family in Puerto Rico. This cynicism regarding her motives was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire hearing. The exchange also touched on the broader issue of the representative's voting record regarding aid packages to the island, which Kennedy scrutinized with his usual precision. He pointed out instances where she had voted against disaster relief bills because they did not contain enough progressive add-ons, effectively delaying aid to her own constituents and family. He argued that this purity spiraling, demanding perfect legislation or nothing at all, had real-world consequences for the people she claimed to love. The blue binder contained the roll call votes, proving that she had sacrificed practical help for ideological posturing. Kennedy framed this as a betrayal of her duty, arguing that a true representative compromises to get blankets and food to the people, rather than holding out for a manifesto. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Kennedy closed the blue binder with a finality that felt like a judgment gavel, leaving the question of the grandmother's welfare hanging in the heavy air. He summarized his position by stating that true compassion is quiet, immediate, and personal, whereas the representative's brand of compassion was loud, delayed, and public. He noted that the American people are tired of leaders who weep on camera but refuse to open their wallets, creating a distinction between Hollywood empathy and heartland duty. The senator's ability to turn a story of victimhood into a story of neglect was a strategic masterstroke that left the representative scrambling to reclaim the moral high ground. The blue binder had successfully transformed her most sympathetic asset into her greatest liability. The aftermath of this segment left the committee room in a stunned silence, the personal nature of the attack lingering like smoke after a fire. Observers noted that the representative looked smaller in her chair, the weight of the accusation regarding her family pressing down on her shoulders. Kennedy, conversely, appeared to have only grown in stature, his calm demeanor reinforcing the idea that he was merely the messenger of an uncomfortable truth. The narrative of the fighter for the people had been pierced by the reality of the neglector of the family, a dissonance that no amount of social media spin could easily reconcile. The hearing was far from over, but the emotional climax had undoubtedly been reached with the closing of the blue folder. This section of the confrontation highlighted the fundamental clash between two worldviews, one that sees the state as the primary engine of care, and one that views the family as the first line of defense. Kennedy's interrogation forced the audience to confront the limits of political rhetoric when faced with personal obligation. By exposing the gap between what the representative demanded of the government and what she demanded of herself, he illuminated the potential hollowness of modern political celebrity. The blue binder served as a reminder that before one tries to save the world, one should perhaps first ensure that their own grandmother has a dry roof. It was a brutal, effective, and unforgettable lesson in the politics of personal responsibility. As the hearing drew to a close, the visual landscape of the witness table told the entire story of the afternoon's proceedings, offering a silent testament to the efficacy of the senator's strategy. Stacked neatly before Senator Kennedy were the 3 color-coded binders, red, green, and blue, forming a physical barricade of evidence that loomed larger than any single soundbite the representative had managed to produce. The sheer volume of the documentation stood in stark contrast to the sparse notes and talking points that lay scattered before the representative, illustrating a fundamental disparity in preparation and intent. The energy in the room had settled into a heavy, contemplative silence, the kind that follows a decisive military engagement where the outcome is clear long before the treaty is signed. Kennedy sat with his hands clasped over the files, his demeanor that of a craftsman who had finished a difficult job, appearing neither triumphant nor angry, but simply satisfied with the restoration of order. The confrontation was widely characterized by political analysts as a decisive strategic victory for Kennedy, primarily because he refused to play the game by his opponent's rules. Rather than engaging in a battle of moral posturing or ideological shouting, which would have played to the representative's strengths on social media, he dragged the conflict into the mundane trenches of administrative verification. By forcing the dialogue to revolve around dates, dollar amounts, and flight logs, he neutralized the charismatic storytelling that typically shields the representative from criticism. The victory lay not in proving a specific crime, but in exposing the fragility of a political brand that relies heavily on the suspension of disbelief. Kennedy demonstrated that when the lights of the theater are turned up and the props are examined, the performance often loses its magic. This hearing highlighted the acute tension between the ephemeral nature of performative politics and the enduring rigidity of legislative scrutiny. The representative arrived equipped for a viral moment, armed with emotional anecdotes and broad, sweeping generalizations designed to garner likes and retweets from a sympathetic base. Kennedy, conversely, arrived equipped for a deposition, armed with the dull but destructive weaponry of the forensic accountant and the auditor. The clash revealed that while emotional resonance is powerful for campaigning, it is woefully insufficient for governance when faced with a determined inquisitor. The receipts served as the ultimate counterweight to the narrative, proving that reality has a paper trail that cannot be erased by a clever caption or an impassioned speech. The psychological impact on the representative was arguably the most significant outcome of the day, as it marked one of the first times her glass jaw had been exposed on a national stage. Throughout the questioning, her usual arsenal of deflections, accusing critics of bias, reframing questions as attacks on her identity, or pivoting to systemic injustice, failed to land against the specific gravity of the evidence. Each time she attempted to soar into the abstract clouds of moral theory, Kennedy's binders acted as an anchor, dragging her back down to the hard earth of factual accountability. This inability to escape the specifics left her appearing diminished, transforming her from a generational leader into a politician scrambling to explain bad bookkeeping. It was a deconstruction of the influencer archetype, showing that eventually, the influencer must answer to the regulator. The use of the color-coded binders was a masterstroke of visual communication, turning the abstract concept of investigation into a tangible object that the audience could see and understand. In the age of television and short attention spans, the physical presence of the dossiers signaled to the viewers that there was weight to the accusations, regardless of whether they understood the nuances of campaign finance law. Kennedy understood that in a visual medium, the person holding the stack of paper looks like the person holding the truth, while the empty-handed person looks unprepared. This prop work was not merely theatrical. It was a psychological anchor that lent an air of undeniable authority to his southern drawl. Every time he opened a binder, the sound of the metal rings snapping echoed like the closing of a trap. Furthermore, the hearing served as an indictment of the media ecosystem that had allowed the representative's inconsistencies to go unchallenged for so long. Kennedy's line of questioning implicitly criticized the press for failing to conduct the basic vetting that his staff had seemingly accomplished with ease. By reading the public records into the Senate archive, he was doing the job that investigative journalists used to do, highlighting the gap between the representative's press clippings and her actual conduct. The strategic victory was therefore twofold. It defeated the opponent in the room, and it exposed the negligence of the protective apparatus that usually surrounded her. It suggested that her reputation was a bubble that had never been pricked by the needle of serious inquiry until that afternoon. The receipts regarding the Puerto Rico timeline and the environmental hypocrisy were particularly damaging because they attacked the representative's two most valuable currencies, her compassion and her urgency. By showing that her compassion was delayed and her urgency was selective, Kennedy eroded the moral foundation upon which her entire legislative agenda rested. The message transmitted to the public was that the crisis was only a crisis when the cameras were rolling, and that personal sacrifice was for the voters, not the leaders. This type of damage is difficult to repair because it breeds cynicism among the very supporters who believed in the purity of the cause. Kennedy did not just attack her policies, he attacked the authenticity of her belief in them. In the aftermath of the hearing, the Kennedy method became a case study for how to combat the rise of populist demagoguery from either side of the political aisle. The lesson was that engaging with the outrage machine is futile. Instead, one must bypass the outrage and target the logistics of the hypocrisy. The senator showed that the most effective way to silence a loud voice is not to shout louder, but to ask quiet, specific questions that have no good answers. The calm persistence he displayed acted as a mirror, reflecting the representative's chaotic evasions back at her, allowing the audience to draw their own conclusions without being told what to think. It was a victory of patience over passion, of the library over the loudspeaker. The narrative arc of the confrontation, from the financial red binder to the environmental green, and finally to the personal blue, created a cumulative effect that was greater than the sum of its parts. A single inconsistency can be dismissed as a mistake, but a pattern of inconsistencies across 3 distinct areas of life suggests a fundamental character flaw. Kennedy's structuring of the hearing was designed to build this narrative of systemic deceit, layering the bricks of evidence until the wall was too high to climb over. By the time the blue binder was closed, the audience was left with the impression of a career built on sand. It was a comprehensive dismantling that left no exit route for the representative to retreat with her dignity fully intact. Ultimately, the hearing highlighted the enduring power of the Senate as an institution of oversight, a place where the frenetic energy of the internet goes to die. In the quiet solemnity of the committee room, the viral metrics and follow accounts that fueled the representative's rise were rendered currency with no value. Kennedy represented the institutional memory and the procedural rigor that acts as a check on the fleeting passions of the mob. The clash was a reminder that while politics has changed, the nature of truth has not. It still resides in the ledger, the logbook, and the receipt. The representative left the room looking for a camera to spin the story, but the senator remained, satisfied that the record spoke for itself. As the committee chair banged the gavel to dismiss the session, the sound punctuated the end of a collision between 2 eras of American politics. The representative gathered her things hurriedly, surrounded by aides who were already typing furious defenses on their phones, eager to escape the physical space of her defeat. Senator Kennedy, however, took his time, stacking his color-coded binders with a deliberate precision, treating them with the respect due to valuable tools. He exchanged a nod with his staff, a silent acknowledgement that the mission had been accomplished and the point had been made. The room emptied, but the story of the binders remained, a cautionary tale for any politician who believes that rhetoric can forever outrun reality. The legacy of this specific confrontation lies in its demonstration that facts, when organized and weaponized by a skilled operator, are still the most potent force in politics. It proved that a well-researched timeline can cut through the thickest fog of emotional manipulation, grounding the debate in the indisputable world of what actually happened. For the representative, it was a harsh induction into the major leagues of legislative combat, a warning that the rules of the Senate are far less forgiving than the rules of Twitter. For the senator, it was a reaffirmation of the old ways, a proof of concept that diligence and detail are the ultimate antidotes to performative virtue. The binders were carried out of the room, but their contents had been indelibly etched into the public record. In the final analysis, the strategic victory was not about changing the representative's mind, nor was it about passing a specific piece of legislation that day. It was about marking the territory of truth and establishing a boundary that the representative could not cross without consequence. Kennedy successfully drew a line in the sand, signaling that while she was free to tell stories, she was not free to invent facts. The friction between the symbol and the scrutiny had produced a spark that illuminated the mechanics of modern political deception. And in that light, the audience could finally see the difference between a public servant and a public performer. The doors of the committee room swung shut, leaving the mahogany tables and the silence behind, but the echoes of the interrogation rippled outward into the news cycle. The clips of Kennedy reading the receipts would circulate for days, not as viral entertainment, but as evidence of a meticulous dismantling. The receipts narrative had overtaken the revolution narrative, proving that in the end, the boring details are the only things that truly matter. The binders were shelved, the microphones turned off, and the Senate moved on to other business, having reminded the world that it is still a place where the truth is expected, if not always found. The confrontation was over, but the lesson remained: never bring a tweet to a binder fight.